Welcome once again to another episode of Bible Beyond the Basics. It's a pleasure to be in your company. I'm your host, Dr. Clinton Baldwin, and Bible Beyond the Basics, as you know, is brought to you by Dikayoma Ministries International. And Dikayoma Ministries International is a non-denominational ministry that has a physical location at 66A Brunswick Avenue in Spanish Town, Jamaica. And we also have our online locations, so the program can be accessed on Facebook, on Instagram, on my personal Facebook page, Clinton Baldwin, and on Dikayoma's website, that will be dikaioma.com, and of course on this podcast platform, Buzzsprout. Dikayoma Ministries International, a non-denominational organization, has congregational worship services at 66A Brunswick Avenue, Spanish Town, Jamaica, every Saturday morning at 10 a.m., and that will be Jamaica time, of course, and every other Sunday morning at 8:30 a.m., and then on a Wednesday night, we have prayer meeting 7 p.m. Of course, these meetings can be accessed on the Zoom platform. So here goes your Zoom connection now, and that would be 883-3844-4496, passcode uppercase DMI. Let me run that one more time. 883-3844-4496, passcode uppercase DMI. So please connect with us through these various media and share in much more goodies that we have to offer. I have been going through a series on the Sabbath, the significance of the Sabbath. And from time to time, we always have to answer the question, why study this subject? Yes, it is important to study because the Sabbath has implications and significance for how people live on a whole. Your jobs. It has implications for the job and the career that you can pursue. There are many people who give up their jobs because they refuse to work on the seventh day. They consider it to be a sacred time, a moral command of God, and as such, they will not continue their regular work on a Saturday. And people suffer hardship and pain, some people that is, for the Sabbath. So it is important to study. Your job, as mentioned before, affects your health, your schooling, and so many things. So speaking of schooling, there are many students who will not do exams, will not attend classes on Saturdays, and that can cause pain, that can cause a lot of heartache. What about your membership in the church? Yes, there are people who accept Jesus, but then they are presented with the option of keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And if they cannot keep the seventh-day Sabbath, then they are denied church membership, despite the fact that they have made a commitment to Jesus. This thing is important, man. Here it is, simply put, it is place on par with Jesus. But let's let's do that for another time. So it's very important. It's very important who you marry. Your position of the Sabbath also have significance where that is concerned. So it is so very, very important topic. And as we start this topic, we have to remind ourselves that those who are so convicted that the seventh-day Sabbath is a moral commandment, they do so from a genuine conviction. Hmm? And they're not bad people. But the fact that one is sincere and genuine regarding one's theological position does not necessarily mean that that theological position is correct. Therefore, as human beings, we have to listen to each other. We continue the dialogue. As I discuss the issue of the Sabbath, I want to make it clear that I'm not condemning Sabbath keepers. I am not saying that if you meet for congregational worship on the seventh day, or if you rest on the seventh day, that you are going to go to hell and you're doing something bad. No, that's not the point. Of course, you can worship any day you feel like. You can congregate for community worship on any day of the week, as far as I'm concerned. The difference is your attitude towards the day, is your position is that the day is a moral requirement of Christians. So it's not simply that you're worshiping on the day, but you're worshiping on the day with the attitude, with the belief system that is, the particular day is a moral requirement for all Christians. It is sacred time. No work ought to be done on that particular day. And those who are working on the seventh day in particular are sinning either ignorantly or deliberately. I hope you see the difference. There are many people who worship on the seventh day, like myself and others who worship on the first day of the week, but they do not see the day as a moral requirement for Christians. What should be our attitude? Should we worship on the day and see it as a moral requirement for Christians? Or should we worship on the day and see it just as time out for God, time out to worship, time out for congregational engagement, not necessarily a time of sacredness? So there is the difference. There's a difference, and it's very, very important. So we want to look at whether or not the particular day is a moral requirement for all Christians. Now, let's look at or continue the theme that we had, and that is Jesus kept the Sabbath. Therefore, it is a mandatory requirement for all Christians. That is how many Christians today look at it. Jesus kept the Sabbath, therefore it ought to be kept. And in the previous episodes, we really discuss and say that, that is really not a strong point for Sabbath keeping. And I will continue to drill down some more in this presentation. Why is it not a strong position for Sabbath keeping? Why is that not a strong argument for continued Sabbath observance today? When I say Sabbath observance now, I'm speaking of mandatory Sabbath observance, seeing the day as sacred. Why is that not the case? The point is, as we pointed out before, Jesus was a Jew, and as a Jew, he practiced many Jewish practices. He kept the Feast of Tabernacles. John chapter 7, read it from verse 2 onwards. He kept the Feast of Tabernacles. That was a Jewish festival. That was a Sabbath as well. From the 15th to the 21st of Tishri, the month Tishri, the 15th was the Sabbath, and the last day was a Sabbath. And Jesus kept that ceremonial, quotes unquote, Sabbath. Therefore, if Jesus's example ought to be followed in every respect, then Christians today, all Christians, should be keeping the specific days of the Feast of Tabernacles, because Jesus did just that. Not only that, they should also offer the required sacrifices on those days, because it was the sacrifices and also rituals that made the feast, the feast. Jews, saw time as time content. That which was practiced within the time made the time time. So in the Feast of Tabernacles, they had different sacrifices, different rituals, which were, mandatory to the particular celebration. Therefore, all Christians should do that today. Jesus kept the Passover. Luke chapter 22, 1 to 8, Matthew 26. Therefore, if Jesus kept the Passover, all Christians today should also keep the Passover, the 14th to the 21st of Nisan. Again, Jesus was a practicing Jew. And as we pointed out, while he was an example for us in principle, the physical expression of the principles as he practiced them do not necessarily carry through for us today. So again, another example, Jesus was circumcised, Luke chapter 2. But from the example of Paul, the book of Galatians, the Apostolic Council, Acts 15, and other places throughout the New Testament, circumcision is not mandatory on Christians today. But Jesus was circumcised. But again, it's not mandatory for Christians today. So the fact that Jesus did something does not necessarily mean that the literal expression of that act is a requirement for Christians today. We pointed out as well, Jesus, as a Jew, participated in animal sacrifices in Matthew chapter 8, verse 4. He commanded the leper to go and offer the sacrifice that Moses commanded. When we read the book of Leviticus, I think Leviticus chapter 7, 14, thereabout, the sacrifice that Moses commanded was animal sacrifices. When a leper was cleansed, he was supposed to report to the priest of the temple, get 2 birds, kill one of the birds, and dip the bird in running water, sprinkle the live bird with the blood of the dead bird, let one of the birds free, and many other rituals. You read it there in Leviticus chapter 14 onwards. So the fact that Jesus kept the Sabbath does not necessarily mean that the Sabbath is mandatory on all Christians today. And if I may run ahead of myself, the Apostle Paul, in particular, and other disciples, they demonstrated this. Author of Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17 clearly communicates that the Sabbath is a symbol, a sign of Jesus, and it is not mandatory on Christians. And I get to Colossians chapter 2 in and of itself. So that Jesus kept the Sabbath cannot be an automatic meaning that the Sabbath ought to be kept. I want for this episode to look at Luke 4:16. There's a particular passage, that I used to use as a Sabbatarian to really hammer the point and convince people that Jesus kept the Sabbath, therefore it ought to be kept. Luke chapter 4:16 through to 18. I will read it for you, and then we just do a quick analysis of that chapter. Luke 4:16, and he came to Nazareth, speaking of Jesus, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and he opened the book and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of all those in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Here it is. As his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Therefore, Jesus kept the Sabbath. It ought to be kept. Not so quick. Let's analyze the passage carefully. First of all, In Luke chapter 3, 21, 22, we see the baptism of Jesus. And then his genealogy is given. In chapter 4, he's led into the wilderness 40 days to be tempted by the devil. And then coming from the wilderness experience, a successful wilderness experience, he launches his mission. So as is well known, Luke 4:16 through to 18, the proclamation of Jesus here in the synagogue is the proclamation of his manifesto, his life's mission he was outlining. Huh? And it's very interesting how he outlines it. First of all, it is said that he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as his custom was. Very important. He went to the synagogue, not the church. Hmm? Granted, there was no church then, but it underscores the point that he was a Jew and he went to the synagogue, a place where Judaism was practiced, and it was his custom. Custom does not necessarily mean moral applications or moral, dictates in all places. A custom is a custom. Huh? Don't need to explain that. But it's his custom. He had a custom as a Jew. Synagogue, Judaism. But that's not the main point of this per se. Let's continue to drill down on the passage. In Luke 4, from verse 18 through to 19, Jesus quoted from Isaiah 58, verse 6, and Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. When you read Isaiah 58, verse 6, 61, 1 and 2, in the interest of time, I'll not read that, because essentially those two passages spliced together here says basically the same thing. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. So Jesus is quoting from Isaiah 58, 6 and 61, 1 and 2. The both passages are spliced together here, and that was a common Jewish practice to splice passages together. It's all over the Bible. In my book, The Person of Jesus, God's Obligatory Sabbath, I have an entire section there in which I just illustrate many places throughout the New Testament, Old Testament, where passages are spliced together in one to make a passage. It's a common Jewish practice in the time of Christ, and probably even now. Not too sure about that. So Jesus quoted from Isaiah 58, 6, 61, 1 and 2. What was the essence of those passages in their primary Isaianic contexts? Isaiah 58, 6, 61, 1 and 2 was about the sabbatical years and also the Jubilee years. What were the sabbatical and Jubilee years? Those were years of complete Sabbath. The sabbatical year occurred every seventh year in Israel. Leviticus chapter 25 outlines that. 24 and 25 outlines the sabbatical Jubilee years. And the Jubilee year occurred every 49, 50 years. Those were years in which the slaves, Jewish slaves, would be set free, they'll be released. Debt would be canceled, so all indebted persons would be freed from all the money they owed. What a beautiful time. The land would lie fallow. They were not supposed to work for that entire year. They were to live off the crops that they reaped the year before. And land that were sold because of certain economic situations had to be returned to the persons who sold in the first place. So those years, the sabbatical and Jubilee years, were supposed to be years of, as the word suggests, Jubilee, freedom, happiness. economic equality, because if debts are released, can you think about it? It's a leveling of the society. That's beautiful years in Israel history. Man, I wondered how they practice that, and maybe aspects of that probably in terms of debt release we may want to practice now. Excuse me. However, the Sabbath and Jubilee years were times of freedom. In the time of Christ as well, the Messiah, it was understood by Jews that the Messiah would inaugurate the sabbatical and Jubilee years. Jesus, throughout the Gospels, presented himself as the Messiah. In fact, in this particular passage, as recorded here in Luke 4:16-17, Jesus was saying he was the Messiah to fulfill the prophecy or the requirement of the sabbatical / Jubilee years. Hence, he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim release to the captives. So as the Jewish slaves would be set free, Jesus was saying, hey, I am here to proclaim release to all bonded persons. Recover of sight to the blind. Preach the good news to the poor. Yes, it was good news if you know your debts are being released. To proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. And the term of the favorable year of the Lord, again, a term to refer to the sabbatical / Jubilee years. So in short, Jesus here in Luke 4:16-18 is saying that he was fulfilling that which the sabbatical and Jubilee years pointed to or symbolized. Hence, in verse 21, he explicitly says, today the scriptures has been fulfilled in your hearing. In other words, Jesus is here saying that he was the fulfillment of the Sabbath. How so? The sabbatical and Jubilee years were years of complete Sabbath, an entire year for Sabbath, every day being a Sabbath. The sabbatical and Jubilee years in the Old Testament were inseparably linked to the seventh-day Sabbath. Very, very important point. They were all called the Moeds of the Lord, the feast of the Lord, the favorable year of the Lord. Leviticus chapter 25, Leviticus chapter 23. They were packages of Sabbath in the Jewish thinking. There were no separation between these Sabbaths. Even the 10 Commandments communicate the point in Exodus chapter 20, verse 10, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, 15, 16. The seventh day is called a Sabbath. The seventh day is a Sabbath. When the Hebrew or the Greek noun is used without the article, it communicates the point of quality. The seventh day is a sabbatical quality, is one of the Sabbaths. That's the point. Huh? So there's an inseparable link between all the Sabbaths in the Old Testament and Jesus here by fulfilling the sabbatical years automatically fulfilled the seventh-day Sabbath as well, because the sabbatical and Jubilee years consisted of Sabbaths. Can't be plainer, can't be plainer. As such, therefore, Jesus was saying here that his life's mission was sabbatical. Jesus was here pointing away from the day to himself. He was not keeping or being in Sabbath here to mandate the sacredness of a particular day. Jesus was here engaging in the Sabbath activity to mandate himself. so to speak, to legislate himself, to present himself as the fulfillment of that which the time, the day represented. He said that explicitly, verse 21. Today, the scriptures is fulfilling your hearing. And as such, therefore, now moving on, in verse 33, in the synagogue, there was a man possessed by the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice, "Let us alone. What business do we have with each other? Jesus of Nazareth, have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Verse 35, Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet." He came out of him without doing anything. Jesus was here releasing the captives, the man who was bound with a demon on the Sabbath. He was demonstrating that he was granting the release that the Sabbath symbolized. Also, in verse 38, he got up, left the synagogue, and entered Simon's house. Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him to help her, and standing up over her, he rebuked the fever, and it left her. So Jesus was here demonstrating the meaning of the Sabbath, that is liberation for the captives, for the sick people, the demon possessed, etc. And by the way, all of those liberation of sickness and demons, etc., in Jewish thinking, the Messiah would inaugurate, would implement all of those things when he comes. By the way, it's also very important to note, that many scholars claim or, present the point that the year in which Jesus entered the synagogue here, most likely AD 26, 27, was a Jubilee year. And Jesus was saying, I am here to fulfill all that the Sabbath represented. So again, Jesus in Luke 4:16 was not mandating Sabbath keeping. He was illustrating the point that he fulfilled the Sabbath, just like what he did when he attended the Feast of Tabernacles in John chapter 7. 34, 35. He attended the Feast of Tabernacles, and then he proclaimed himself, I am the light of the world. In John 6, he attended Passover and presented himself the bread of life. Light of the world at Tabernacles. At Tabernacles, they had a light festival. Light rituals was part of the tabernacles, and also water rituals with the same feast. He presented himself as the water of life. So Jesus attended tabernacles and proclaimed himself the meaning of tabernacles. He attended Passover and proclaimed himself the bread of life. The meaning of the key symbols of Passover, the meaning of Passover. So within the Gospels, Jesus, as he participated in the Sabbath and other Jewish rituals, was not mandating the continued observance of those rituals. No, he was demonstrating that he was the meaning, the significance, the demonstration of what those symbols, those rituals represented. Very, very important principle to communicate and to get. We ought not to have the symbol pointing to Jesus, the reality, and then the reality fulfilling the symbol and pointing back to the symbol in a way that makes the symbol mandatory. No, man, that's confusing. That's confusion. That's not reasonable. You cannot have the lamb pointing to Jesus and have Jesus fulfilling the lamb, the sacrifice, and pointing back to the sacrifice in a way that made the sacrifice mandatory while he continues to be the sacrifice. That is contrary to the entire New Testament, even to common sense. You cannot have the symbol, the Sabbath, or Passover, or Pentecost, pointing to Christ, Christ fulfilling it, becoming the reality of it. And at the same time, he pointing back to the symbol that makes the symbol mandatory. If such were the case, then the reality is serving the function of the symbol. and then the reality and the symbol will have the same import, the same significance, the same potency. Can't work, can't work. So again, Jesus' Sabbath keeping in Luke 4:16, as is presented in the passage, was to communicate the point that Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath. And if he fulfilled the Sabbath, then we know from other New Testament scriptures like Colossians chapter 2, Galatians chapter 4, Romans chapter 14, that because he fulfilled it, because he continues to represent it, the literal expression of it, the dayness of it, is neither here nor there. Very, very important. So much more could be said here, but time is against me. And so I will rest it at this point for this week, and we will rehearse and, continue the conversation where this is concerned. But just want to close with this, that on another day as well, in which Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath, Matthew 11:28, he said, "Come unto me, all you are labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28, 29, 30. And then the conversation continues in 12 verse 1, which shows that when Jesus said these words, "Come unto me and I will give you rest," it was on a Sabbath. So Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath rest. He said, "Come unto me, not the day, but come to me and I will give you rest." And that would be rest irrespective of days, of course. Brothers and sisters, the point of this presentation is that the fact that Jesus kept the Sabbath does not mean that is a mandatory requirement for Christians today. Jesus' act of observing the Sabbath as presented in the Gospels was to demonstrate that he was the meaning of the Sabbath, that he fulfilled the Sabbath. And most Sabbatarians understand the point from the perspective of the other Sabbaths like Passover and Tabernacles and Pentecost. Most Sabbatarians do not observe those Sabbaths. Why? Because they rightly conclude Jesus fulfilled them. Hey, Luke 4:16 through to 18 is saying that Jesus fulfilled the seventh-day Sabbath as well. Therefore, if based on the grounds of fulfillment, the Sabbaths like Passover, Pentecost, New Moons, Tabernacles ought not to be kept, then logically the seventh-day Sabbath ought not to be kept, ought not to be a mandatory command as well, because it too was fulfilled in Jesus. I think that the issue pertaining to whether or not the Sabbath is mandatory is really an issue as to the authority of Jesus. There are many people who cast the conversation one day versus the other. As I often say, that's not the point of the New Testament. Sunday is not the Sabbath. Neither is Saturday. The issue is not between Saturday versus Sunday. The issue is between a day and a person. The day being Jesus, the seventh day in the New Testament, and the person being Jesus. That's the issue. And just as saying here, I fulfill the Sabbath just as I fulfill Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, Hanukkah, all of those other holy times, sacred days of the Old Testament. So the issue is between Jesus and the day. And many people cannot see the issue pertaining to the Sabbath in its proper context because they are making a toss-up between one day versus the other. When we focus more on Jesus, then we recognize that the day is optional. As such, therefore, if you congregate for worship on the seventh day, you're not going to hell. If you congregate for worship on the first of the week, you're not going to hell either. You're not breaking any moral command. Why? Because on both times you are in Christ. on both times, you are literally keeping Sabbath, because the Sabbath has now moved away from the observance of a day. The Sabbath has now moved away from being a day to being a person, Jesus Christ. And Jesus cannot be bounded by days. May the Lord help us as we continue to think on these things. I think is important because it makes us more loving, more understanding. It prevents us from going through heartaches and suffering, unnecessary heartaches and suffering with respect to a day, and it brings more unity in the body of Christ. This is another episode of Bible Beyond the Basics. I want to thank you for your time, for listening in, and for sharing. May God bless you real good. And I will continue this conversation as I look next time around on Mark chapter 2:27. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That's another punchline in the New Testament. I want to take that up on the next conversation. God bless you real good. Thanks for sharing with me. Continue to study, continue to love one another. And as we normally say in a typical Jamaican parlance, walk good. Take care of yourself. Blessings. See you next episode. Bye-bye. I'm Dr. Clinton Baldwin. That will be on the basics. The Communities International, where the love of Jesus motivates. I thank you.